Okay, yeah, no, thanks. Thanks. We're recording this webinar, and we will be distributing the content through various channels when we're done. But the whole goal today is to show some of the case studies that have come up in the past year or so, and to showcase what the new reporting looks like. And we're going to cover this from the perspective of return to play after injury, the whole space of neurological conditions and monitoring in that environment. And then Megan's going to spend some time looking at some cases on remote patient monitoring, and we'll try to do this in pretty efficiently over the next 30 to 40 minutes, and make sure that we're making best use of our time. So just a quick reminder for those, if you haven't seen Plantiga, it's pretty simple. It's a smart insole. And I say that the technology is pretty impressive, but it's the least impressive thing about the company, because it's not just about putting a sensor in an insole. I mean, that's an easy thing to do, relatively speaking. The hard part is building a high quality sensor that's lab grade, extracting metrics, using artificial intelligence to make measurements around biomechanics, and then transferring this into a good user-based platform where you can actually use this system to affect some change in the lives of your clients and your patients. So these are ultra thin sensors. We're actually releasing new hardware in Q1 of 2023. We've actually shrunk the size of the IMU substantially, so it's even smaller now than it was before. And we've got some really cool new features on the web app that are allowing so many of our users to actually now really take the system and convert it into a whole other level of value for their businesses and for their clients and patients, with this report feature, which allows you to literally print this immersive report off of some assessments. So the mission's pretty straightforward. We want to be the next vital sign in the world of health. And if you think about it, we got wearables that do all sorts of things, but it's amazing that you don't have anything other than your, potentially your Apple Watch measuring your strides or step counts or something like that. But Plantiga is really different because we are sampling at such a high frequency, and we are able to really pinpoint movement deficits with our system. We are sort of really tackling this problem of being the next wearable tech in the stack, and establishing movement as the next vital sign. So today the goal is to talk about how we go from data to to sort of all the stuff that we do on the back end to take this data and make it into something useful. And then we're going to really focus on the final two boxes here, which is presenting the data and showing what we see on our end and how you can use this to tell a better story to your clients. So I'm going to kick it off. I'm going to give two examples around lower body MSK injuries and in the space of ACL injury, and then I'm going to throw it to Lauren and Megan. So let's jump into it. So this first case study is called Maximal Force versus Rapid Force, and I think that most people are pretty aware of what maximal force is. It's how strong you are, and it's often considered to be the sort of hallmark for testing an athlete after injury, is to make sure that they've restored their strength. But you might be surprised to know that a high fraction of practitioners, they don't even measure strength; they just use time. So it's been 10 months, and hey, think it's time that you give it a go. Like, go back to sports, see how you fare. Just don't go too hard. Ease yourself back in. And meanwhile, the clinician is possibly missing that their patient is, despite being 10 months post surgery, is still presenting with some extremely large neuromuscular deficits that, if they knew it was there, they could do something about it to fix it and make it better. So this case study is a great example of that. It's an example of an alpine skier who suffers a knee injury. They have a right ACL reconstruction and a medial meniscectomy. And the goal here for one of our power users, Nico Berg, is to help really guide this return to play or return to snow progression. So to kick it off, I also just kind of want to remind everybody who may be watching this that all the rage right now is a force plate. You get a dual force plate system, you bring it in your lab, you do jump tests, and no doubt, extremely valuable. But we all understand that in the space of milestones and a criteria-based approach to rehab, is we want to be progressing people after something like an ACL injury across all the various milestones as they recover. And I just thought it would be cool to show the walking progression that we can measure with Plantiga. We're just showing the average pace here, which is just obviously one simple thing that we can pull from the system. But you have a high-grade biomechanical device in your hands with this. You can measure walking, running, and jumping. You can measure activity out in the open. So you could be playing basketball or playing soccer and looking at load asymmetries. Our system is going to have the capability, already does have the capability to recognize when you're walking, running, and jumping, but you can actually extract this stuff from complex movement. And this is just an example of all the great things you can do with Plantiga. So think about a force plate. Think about 3D motion capture, and now think about us bridging that gap and putting this in your hands for $2,000 a year, where you can actually take this system and generate the same types of information that you can from these systems that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and take tons of resource and knowledge. We're putting this in your hands to be able to help you bridge the gap in your clinical or sport performance environment. So in this particular case study, one thing I want to emphasize is the whole idea around making sure you're measuring something. And I always say you got to kind of figure out what matters, measure what matters, and track what matters. And that's a kind of a key cornerstone to an ACL rehab. Typically, we look at strength as a kind of a core outcome measure. Here, what you're seeing on the screen are strength asymmetry levels. And so this is comparing the non-injured limb to the injured side. So if you see a value of 25, that would mean that the non-injured limb is 25% stronger than the injured side. And what you're visualizing on this graph is the time course recovery in asymmetries from the red zone, i.e., you're quite asymmetrical, down through the yellow zone, orange, I guess that's orange, I think. Sort of moderate levels of asymmetry, and then down into what we would say is acceptable. It's like an interlimb difference of 5 to 10% is sort of the threshold to say, you're good to go. Let's give this a whirl. So you can see that over time. There's been a little bit of, I guess you could say, a fluctuation in the data. It's really critical to mention that ACL injury doesn't just affect that injured side, right? It actually also affects the contralateral limb. So as you're tracking these things over time, it's essential to always be thinking about the fact that your other side can actually be impaired by the injury as well. And so that whole idea of limb symmetry, we want two strong limbs and we want them to be relatively symmetrical. That's kind of the goal. But the latest research is suggesting that just simply looking at strength may not be enough. And the reason is that I'll give a sort of a shout out to Enda King, who's a researcher now down at Aspetar. He published a really nice study, more than 1,400 level 1 athletes from Ireland, athletes who had ACL reconstruction, and they followed them prospectively, where they did a whole bunch of biomechanical testing, along with your conventional tests, right? So hops for distance and all this. And long story short is that all of your conventional measures that we typically look at in these level 1 athletes were actually not overly sensitive to the re-injury rates. And in fact, one of the measures that was predictive of a future risk of a re-injury, so an ACL re-injury, was this idea of rapid force capacity, which we measure in jumping. Now, in Enda's study, they looked at it in drop jumping, but our system with Plantiga lets us examine measures like the reactive strength index. It's a ratio of how high did you jump to how fast did you jump. We can look at this in cyclic hopping. We can look this in sort of in-place jumping. But what you're seeing here in this case study is an example of why we need to take a nice, big, broad approach to evaluating athletes after ACL injury. I always say it's like Sherlock Holmes. You want to use your magnifying glass, your DNA kit, and all the tools at your disposal to hunt for those hidden deficits. And despite the fact that this patient was looking quite good in terms of their strength asymmetries as they progressed along, we can see that at 1 year post-op, this person's still presenting with a 20% different side-to-side difference in terms of their reactive strength index. So that's measured in the vertical jump, and it's a ratio of the flight time to the ground contraction time in this particular measure. But you can see that there are some substantial deficits in this person's functional capacities. And why is this so important? Because you can think about this like an Audi S4 versus a squishy Cadillac. The higher the RSI, the more you're operating like an Audi S4. And the most current evidence we have, and I'm talking sort of year 2021 and 2022, highlights how critical this is to measure in the context of ACL injury. So it's absolutely a very big part of the return to sport testing process. So a couple takeaways after our first case study. Number one, what's the difference between just being strong and being able to make force fast? Well, the main difference is that making force fast is underpinned by different physiological, biomechanical, neurological underpinnings. It's got, a high relevance in the space of return to sport, especially around potentially identifying athletes who might be at higher risk for re-injury. And the big thing here is that not only is it an equally important predictor of injury, at the very least, potentially even a better predictor, but the whole point is that anybody who is either in physiotherapy or you're a chiropractor or you're a strength and conditioning coach, is if you knew the deficit was there, you could address it by providing the right type of training and the right type of progressions to bridge the gap from where the person is to where they need to go. But if you're not measuring, you're guessing. And in this context, the idea is that we're providing this scaffolding for you to use this in a very usable way to identify some of these gold standard measures that are being used for ACL rehab. This example, as the story goes, lots of targeted training was prescribed with a particular focus on eccentric control and that plyometric ability. And again, Plantiga would let you track this easily in your clinical environment over time. I can tell you that Nico uses this 20, 30 times a day in his clinic at Lynn Valley, where he's got a kinesiologist who runs the testing, and then he's able to sit down with the patient, review the data, look at the report, email the report, send the report to the surgeon, sell the report, right, to generate some revenue off of it, track progress for his clients and his patients in order to make sure that they're moving towards their targets. These are all the things that we need to change behavior and really optimize rehab after something like an ACL injury. So last example here, and then I'm going to pass it along, is another return to play example. In this case, it's a high-level soccer player with an right ACL reconstruction, and going to show some data looking at determining return to play readiness. But this story is a little bit different because the standard of practice that you may be familiar with up until probably the past year and a half, 2 years, where there's been an increasingly greater awareness placed on measuring the biomechanics. So how did you do the jump? Not just how far did you jump, but actually how did you do it? What an increasing number of studies are showing is that our conventional tests for determining return to sport readiness after an ACL injury, like hops for distance, triple hops, are not overly sensitive for re-injury. In fact, there's a study done by Grindam and their co-authors that was published in the mid-2000s, like 2012, 13 range. Actually, it was a little bit later than that. But the point of the study was, again, a prospective study where they evaluated patients who had undergone standard tests for ACL rehab, like your hops for distance. And it was really interesting to note that only quad strength asymmetry was a predictor of sort of people who had better levels of limb symmetry and quad strength were fared better after their ACL injury in terms of re-injury. But the second thing is that if you actually look at the tables in that particular study, the group that goes on to suffer a re-injury actually scores better in a lot of these tests, these conventional clinical tests of readiness. So our tests, if you're scoring better on them and you're actually probably likely to fare worse, probably not a great test, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is here. So this example right now, single leg hop for distance, this was all measured with Plantiga. So yes, we can measure your distance in jumping, no problem in your conventional tests. You'll notice that this person is got a small asymmetry, 1% right side dominant, and they were a right side B injury. So technically, if you're using this, check the box, you're ready to get back to sport, away you go, get back on the field of play, go back to play some soccer. But with Plantiga, not only can we look at the criteria that you would typically see, but we can actually measure how they're performing. And because we're able to really carefully determine when the foot is on and off the ground, you'll notice the fact that despite the fact that they've actually achieved relatively good jump distance, symmetry-wise, you'll actually notice that the acceleration at takeoff and the acceleration at landing indicates a very, very pronounced interlimb asymmetry that would be reflecting the fact that that non-injured limb is performing at a higher level. So this is a great example where you know, our tests need to be sort of measuring how the person's doing the test rather than just how far did you jump, how high did you jump, and those sorts of things. So you may be wondering, how is this possible? Well, I've given a little screen cap here of a recent study that was looking at the relative contribution of the hip, knee, and ankle during vertical and horizontal hop performance. And the whole reason that, you know, this study was sort of taking this line was to say, our standard right now of looking at this horizontal hop, what it actually shows, if you look at the left here, is that the knee joint contribution is relatively small in terms of the total amount of power propulsion that's being contributed at the knee joint. So in this case, you'll notice that it's about 13% relative to the other joints, which are quite high. And then if you look at the case of the vertical hop, so going straight up and down, you'll notice that that contribution from the knee joint starts to go way up. So we're talking here about 34% at the knee joint. And so then we sort of fast forward to the landing scenario. You'll notice here that in landing in a single leg hop, the knee is doing about 65% of the sort of total contribution of dissipating that external energy. Whereas in the vertical jump, right, the vertical jump landing, the knee is contributing more symmetrically relative to the other joints. So what happened with Plantiga? What were we able to see with this this sort of brain conundrum? Your hop distances are pretty symmetrical, but we look at your accelerations and wow, holy cow, you're way different on the left compared to the right. Well, the main thing that we can see is that on the left side, which is her non-injured side, you can actually see that she has greater air time. So that means she's jumping like a parabola, like she's actually kind of cresting through the air. So she's actually spending longer in the air, but is not actually propelling herself forward, meaning she's not jumping forward as much as compared to the right side. And that would be a great example of a replacement of a knee strategy on the injured side with a hip strategy. So if your knee is deficient, right, which we know happens after an ACL injury, you're just going to leverage the hip and the ankle to create performance. And I would be betting money that this individual has a hip and ankle dominant strategy on her injured side, and therefore is able to achieve symmetrical performance while masking the deficits that we really care about, which is what is going on at the knee. So just to give you another example of having a broad approach to ACL rehab, in this case, our power user, Nico Berg, was also looking at vertical jumping. And you'll see that despite the fact that there is only a 1% difference side to side in hop performance horizontally, we also see a similar trend with the vertical jump performance as we do with the sort of how did you do that horizontal jump. We see here that we can see asymmetries of between 20 and 30% that are still persistent in the case of the vertical jump. So what's the recommendation here? Well, the main recommendation is don't just hang your hat on a single jump. If you're going to do a horizontal jump, you're going to need to measure how they do that, specifically the landing in the case of an ACL injury. If you're not measuring the landing, all bets are off. And certainly because we want to create an athlete who's restored all of their strength capacities, we're not just looking at horizontal jumping, but we want to see vertical jumping. We want to see your sprinting asymmetries. We want to look at your walking asymmetries. We want to look at ground contact asymmetries in sprinting, especially for a soccer player where we're trying to restore their on-field performance. And those are all things that can be done with the Plantiga system in the case of ACL rehab. So with that, a few takeaways. This is good evidence of how somebody cheats the system, so to speak, in a rehab scenario where you're able to almost like fake out the clinician, right? Because you're hitting the benchmark, but clearly stuff is still there that needs to be worked on. It also brings to our attention the importance of having tests that really put the emphasis on the knee joint rather than the hip. And again, just this idea for broad testing, not just hanging your hat on one test. We want to make sure you can walk before you jog, before you jump on one leg, you're jumping on two legs, before you're jumping fast, you're jumping slow, before you get back on the field and sprinting and changing direction, you're able to do that in a linear way. again, Plantiga gives the scaffolding to look at all that stuff in a relatively intuitive way with great reports, and also with relative ease of use. So with that, I'm going to throw over to Lauren.
All righty. Thanks, Matt. Such a good breakdown of the MSK injuries. So I'm going to talk a little bit about using Plantiga for neurological conditions. And this is really critical for things like stroke, for Parkinson's, for muscular dystrophy, even for things like concussion, because those conditions can really present themselves in gait patterns, and particularly in changing gait patterns. And especially with the first few that I mentioned, like stroke and Parkinson's, and even just general aging, falls risk is a really big deal. But falls don't happen in a lab, they happen in the real world. And so bringing the data collection out of the lab into the conditions where those environments, can trigger falls or contribute, that's really key in understanding the mechanisms of those falls and being able to prevent them. So I'm going to talk about two different case studies here. The first one is with Parkinson's. So just as a little bit of background, the individual in this case study developed Parkinson's from a traumatic brain injury. And it was just kind of at the start of COVID that they were seeing their physiotherapist regularly, seeing their Parkinson's specific doctor regularly, but all that got shut down. And so he wasn't able to access the resources that he needed. And he knew that his gait was becoming an issue because he'd had a number of falls, and his Parkinson's was degenerative and he was having declining gait patterns. So he sort of stumbled upon Plantiga through a mutual friend, and came in for a first assessment. In his first assessment, his gait speed was 0.83 meters per second. And just for reference, the clinical threshold for a high falls risk is 1 meter per second. So he was walking much slower than would be, technically considered safe in a clinical setting. He also had quite high double support. So that's the percentage of gait that you're spent with both feet on the ground. So in gait, you either have 1 foot on the ground when you're stepping through, or you have 2 feet. And it's a really good measure of balance and confidence in balance. So if you're not confident on being on 1 foot, you're going to try to spend more time on 2 feet. And so for this individual who knew that he had a high falls risk, who had suffered some falls before, his double support was almost 30%, and the healthy normative value for that is 20. So those are two key metrics that we really wanted to focus on with his gait retraining to allow him to just be more functional and be able to be, mobile and not so afraid of falling. So the game plan was to do biweekly assessments. He would come in every 2 weeks. We would do a 2-minute walk test, and in between, he would have homework to work on. And so we started by focusing on increasing cadence and stride length alternately, with the goal of improving his gait speed to above 1 meter per second. So every week we had different strategies for this homework, but in the data, we can see that his average pace was steadily increasing. There's like a little bit of fluctuation, as you would expect. But if we take a look at the cadence graph, it's actually quite interesting. You can see which component we were focusing on for the 2-week segments. So the cadence kind of goes up and down as we focused on increasing cadence by using a metronome, for example. The next week, the cadence would be up, but then we would shift to looking at stride length. So it's hard to focus on 2 things at once. So the cadence would sometimes take a dip as the stride length increased, but we were basically working on stepping both of them up a little bit at a time until they could both step up a lot at a time. And just the improvement in these metrics is really reflected in the walking pace, because pace is composed of cadence and stride length. So that was the strategy. As his gait speed improved, we also wanted to address the balance component of his gait, as we mentioned, with the double support. So this was the metric that we were using. And as he walked more, he became more confident as he developed the strength, and he knew that he was able to sustain higher speeds. He was able to decrease his double support. And double support is correlated with speed. So as you walk faster, you will naturally have a lower double support percentage. But we use this kind of as a cue to help him remember that he, needed to be focusing on the balance and confidence, and just using it as a metric, kind of like a proxy metric, I suppose. So after a year, his gait speed had increased to 1.43 meters per second. And for reference, the healthy norm for his age group is 1.34. So he was actually walking faster than people who are healthy in his age group, which is pretty incredible. And his double support was decreased to 19%, which again is better than the healthy norm. So he came in walking like someone who definitely looked like they had Parkinson's. He had the kind of characteristic shuffle step. He was walking quite slowly. After a year, if you saw him walking on the street, you would have no idea. He was way above the 1 meter per second clinical threshold that we were looking for at the start of his gait retraining, and his falls risk is significantly decreased. So essentially, we used the data to help drive the homework that we were working on in those 2-week intervals. And showing the data to this individual was incredibly motivating because he could see his progress. He could see when cadence dipped the next week, that's what we would be working on. And it really helped to just focus our efforts in improving his gait speed. So that's our first neurological case study. The second one, we're going to actually talk a little bit about how interventions can be assessed using data. So like I said before, falls don't actually happen in a lab or in a clinic, they happen in the real world. And so the interventions that are implemented to, help avoid dangerous situations like that, it's really hard to know if they actually work if you don't collect data in the ecologically relevant situations. So for this individual, they have facioscapulohumeral muscular dystrophy, or FSHD, which is a relatively rare neurodegenerative disorder, and it affects muscle function. And so this individual had developed foot drop, which had actually caused him a number of falls, and he was prescribed a foot drop brace. So as a very curious person, he wanted to know how that foot drop brace affected his gait and whether or not it was actually doing the job it was supposed to be doing. And so he had been using Plantiga for about 3 months just to monitor his gait. And then he, of his own volition, decided to do a half and half walk. So the first half of his walk, he wore the foot drop brace, and the second half of his walk, he took it off. And we took a look at the different gait patterns that he had. So as you might expect, some asymmetries did develop when he took off the brace. And just for anybody who doesn't know what foot drop is, essentially the individual is unable to bring their foot up as they go through the swing phase. And so the brace helps them keep their foot so that it isn't like a tripping hazard and so that they can maintain a more regular gait pattern. So when he took the foot drop brace off, the most prominent change was in the vertical takeoff and landing accelerations, which are sort of a Plantiga specific metric. It's essentially looking at how your foot interacts with the ground and how differently you toe off and foot strike. So in the with brace condition, they were pretty symmetrical, pretty normal. And then as soon as he took the brace off, he was unable to bring his foot up. And so he had to essentially use like a slapping strategy to bring his left side through. And so that's where the vertical landing accelerations are coming from, where the left side is just hitting the ground a lot harder because he doesn't have the neuromuscular control to bring it down softly. With the vertical takeoff accelerations, this one's kind of interesting because the foot drop brace in his particular case is a carbon plate underneath the foot. And so it actually provides a little bit of propulsion as like the energy is stored through the toe off. And so when he took the brace off, his left side, which is the one with the brace, it no longer had that stored energy, and he had to use a different strategy to bring his foot through, which is where the asymmetry came from. So he essentially used more of a hip and knee dominant strategy rather than an ankle strategy. So these were the two most prominent asymmetries, but what was also really interesting was that some things didn't change. So his ground contact time asymmetry stayed about the same, which means that he wasn't using a limping strategy in either condition. And so that's quite good to know. He's pretty functional in both conditions. But just the way that he implements his compensation strategies in the vertical takeoff and landing accelerations allows him to walk without a limp in both conditions. In graphs that aren't shown on the screen here because we had limited space, his walking speed did decrease from 1.75 meters per second to 1.48 meters per second, but his cadence stayed the same. So the other shift in his gait strategy was that he took shorter strides so that he could have a little bit more control and so that he wouldn't have to swing his foot through quite so much. So that was the foot drop brace. What does that mean? He adopted some subconscious gait adjustments. So like I mentioned, as he's not able to swing and control his foot through, the left foot slaps onto the ground, and that's where the landing acceleration asymmetry comes from. He developed a different toe-off strategy. He has to pull his foot forward with the hip and knee, whereas with the foot drop brace, it sort of springs itself forward. And he started taking shorter steps to minimize his perceived falls risk. So takeaways, this individual has really good compensation strategies to minimize the limp in both conditions. But the foot drop brace does do what it's supposed to do. It helps him maintain a faster walking speed, which in itself helps to decrease falls risk. So he will continue to wear his foot drop brace. So those are our neurological case studies. I'm going to throw it over to Megan to go through some remote monitoring case studies. And that's all you, Megan. Oh, I might have to unmute you there. Sorry. Hold on a second here. We're just figuring out the screen controls. Can you unmute yourself now, Megan?
There we go.
Okay. Let me give you a remote control here.
Perfect.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, I'm just going to get onto the screen. Okay, so the case study that I wanted, or I chose for this, because of it's very unique, and FAI, so femoral acetabular impingement, it's not really something that gets a lot of attention in literature, and there's very little, especially with like training and intervention methodologies in the research. So I wanted to highlight it because I have a little bit of a, I guess, unique perspective. Over the past 10 years, as I've had the hat as a researcher and as a strength and conditioning professional, specifically with like anaerobic type strength athletes, whether, they're powerlifters, Olympic weightlifters, or sprinters. And something really unique is that FAI seems to be more predominant in these types of athletes. And I had the opportunity to work with a few of them. So in this one, we have a sprinter who was diagnosed with FAI and was interested in figuring out if there's any type of other options other than just surgery, because he really wanted to become more competitive as he moved into the masters category in sprinting. And this condition, so I'll give you a really unique example is I worked with an athlete before, and she was part of triplets. And she started experiencing, anterior hip pain, and then was diagnosed with FAI. And because she was the only high level athlete in the family, the other sisters, they never experienced any pain, but they did eventually get checked out, and all three of them had FAI. But it was the unique conditions chronically that this athlete she was exposed to made her predisposed to this pain and this condition. So similarly with this individual, he was getting anterior hip pain, wanted to have these non-surgical options, and was in a sport that required a lot of loading on the hip, obviously with sprinting, max sprint efforts, and a lot of range of motion at the hip as well. So the big interesting point whenever we move to, going back up. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay. When going into his baseline, looking at his sprint performance, he described that, his top upright position, once he hits max speed, that's kind of like his weakest link. And really when he doesn't always experience pain in his hip, but it would become more present as he was like peaking for a track meet. And we looked at his foot speed profiles, and his FAI is in his left side. So it's his left hip. And when we look at actually the foot speed profiles, the left is in the orange and the right is in the green. And if you were just kind of like look at this at first thought, you'd be like, okay, it looks like the right side is the underperformer. But really his strategy, what he was using was he was cutting his right stride short in order to limit the range of motion at the hip to stay pain-free. So this was a strategy that really got reinforced over time. And it was also reflected in the fact, that his best part of his sprint profile was, the initial acceleration phase, which is really, knee extensor dependent, and then the top end position more hip extensor dependent for overall performance. And then when you looked at his single leg jumps, we also saw that this was reflected in his single leg jump for distance asymmetries and overall performance. So he had fairly high achieving single leg jump for height, performance and symmetry. So very knee extensor reliant, performance reliant. And then for distance, which is really dependent on hip extensor performance, we saw not only just, like it was his relatively weaker contribution to his movement, but also that's where the asymmetry was really strong. And we can see that takeoff acceleration asymmetry was substantially larger on one side. And so we're looking at that really that deficit in his ability of his left foot to really, leave the ground quickly. So not only just looking at overall performance and what phase of the sprint was the deficit, but also looking at what aspect of it was his initial like toe off, was it his, impact, initial impact, landing position, technique. And what we wanted to do then was to create an intervention that was twofold. Overall performance is great, and being more efficient, decreasing asymmetries is very important for overall sprint performance. But what's the point of competing if you're always going to be in pain and your overall quality of life is really impacted, and these athletes really start resenting the sport that they love so much because of it. So the premise is of using really purposeful hip extensor targeted, specifically really trying to get those glutes, their performance up to par, was, the initial for performance improvements. But when you look at FAI and you have someone with this, bony overgrowth, whether it is on the femur itself or on the pelvis, that we want to be avoiding as much as possible a lot of contact and tension in the area. And you have a sprinter who is very knee extensor dominant, who really likes to use his knee extensors, his quads to really pick up the slack or compensate, and it positions himself to really maximize, similar to what Matt was touching base on with jumping and the strategy that you can kind of cheat and transfer loading as a compensation strategy. You also have someone who probably has a lot of imbalances in the forces that are acting on the femur. So the quads, they have that anterior pull. Glutes, they have the posterior pull. So you have this large amount of forces line of pull that's always wanting to pull the head of the femur forward into the hip socket in someone who we really want to be avoiding that as much as possible. So the hip extensor glute focus intervention, we prioritized really purposeful movements. So for example, whenever you try to get him to do like a box squat or a hang clean or power clean, he just really wanted to use his quads. Like everything was quads, everything was upright. And so it involved really getting him to scale back the weight in order to prioritize purposeful movements and create that mechanical disadvantage for his glutes. And, we have someone who is very strong and a high level performing athlete. And the fact that they struggled to do like, a hip thrust movement with no weight, it really just, highlighted that there was a lot of compensation going on for a really long time. So after a little bit of time there, we also eventually added in, once he was getting more and more time on the track, some manual release strategies for his hip flexors, just to even limit as much as possible that forward pull of the femur in the hip joint, because he was really trying to quickly return that left leg as quick as possible to get it out of a more extended position where he was experiencing most pain. And so his hip flexor would get pretty tight there as well. And the benefits, we'll look at, those foot speed profiles like that. That was a very, you can't argue the change in the foot speed profiles and that right stride. So we don't see the green lines for the right foot speed profiles being cut short anymore, because there was that improvement in that available pain-free range of motion with the intervention strategy. And then also it was reflected in the single leg jump for distance. So it's just really hitting home that if we know how the muscle contributes during the, what really is the make it or break it muscle group for a performance in a movement like, distance jumping versus vertical jumping. And we can see where that change is happening over time. It confirms that you're getting that efficient or that effective training stimulus that you're going for. So both sides, we saw an undeniable increase in his single leg jump distance performance. Note that some of this was in the middle of a competition season or a deload. But the other important part is that the symmetry was also improved. So it wasn't just that, he became more symmetrical, both hip extensors, his hip extensor performance, his single leg jump for distance performance increased and symmetry improved as well. And so the big take home is really like whenever you have tools that, they can give you data, it's great. But knowing what to do with that data and knowing the power of that movement, and just knowing the ins and outs of it a little bit more, and how those muscles contribute, and how the body likes to do its easiest, and sometimes that's not necessarily what's best, and it really wants to take advantage of its strengths. And you have certain athletes that are in more high intensity efforts. They're always chronically reinforcing these strengths, and a lot of the times when it comes to performance declines and plateauing and injury mechanisms, it goes back to that that weakest link and the chain reaction that it causes. So pass it off back to Lauren.
Yeah, alrighty. Thanks, Megan. So we have about 10 minutes here for some questions if anybody has them. I see that there are 3 in the chat here. Okay, so first question here. How do you deal with individuals who think they're ready to return to play but are not actually?
I'll kick it off.
Yeah, go ahead.
I use a bucket of blue chips and red chips, and I've literally got 3 buckets of blue chips and red chips beside my desk. And one is a risk profile. Well, actually, I start with a risk profile for somebody who's never had a knee injury, for example, if we're talking about the context of ACL injury. And I got a bucket that shows the risk profile of getting hurt again. So you got a 14 times greater risk of getting hurt again after that first ACL injury. Lots of different reports, but that's probably a conservative estimate. And then I talk about how that risk profile might change if you take your time to fully get your strength, readiness, psychologically, physically, all that stuff ready to go before you go back. And how, if you're pulling from a bucket of blue chips and red chips, and I try to make it around an analogy that everyone can understand, like planning your wedding day, and if that was a chance of rain, which day would you pick? Right. And, using those sorts of relatable examples that lets the individual kind of understand probability at a kind of a fundamental level. And the idea that if I pull a red chip, I'm getting hurt again. I get a blue chip and I'm good. And would you rather pull from the bucket where you've got a 14 times greater risk, or would you rather wait? And I found that to be pretty effective. And the only other thing I'll say, Lauren, and then I'm going to throw it over you guys, is a team approach, right? So what I've noticed in the space of rehab and ACL injury is that the more people work together in a team, the better. And so this idea that it's complex, it's not just one factor. You need the strength coach, you need the physiotherapist, you need the surgeon, you need the sports psychologist. You need to have all these people working together in a team environment, and that's ideal. I realize that's ideal. But in a perfect world, the more you can kind of spread the decision making across more than just yourself to other people, the better. And the better you, more effective you are at using your data to help anchor those conversations. I find that that's the key to success for that world, when people don't want to wait.
No, that's totally it, Matt. Like it's about, you can tell someone to do something, but if you can transfer the knowledge and like tell them the why behind it and the purpose of it, and communicate that it's not an overnight thing and set those expectations. That is really the big with, what they always want to kind of like jump back in, and they might even try to not tell you that they maybe did something that they shouldn't have. So there's only so much you can control when you're not there. And, practitioners, they can't be everywhere all at once for all their patients. And so that little bit of, extra, context and knowledge transfer and just communicating, the why is the big one, rather than just being like, here's here's what you need to do it.
Totally. I got nothing to add. You guys hit all the boxes there. Okay, next question. Why were we using the conventional ACL metrics in the first place if they weren't actually that sensitive?
Well, I think that's an easy answer, because they were easy to use, right? So I think at the end of the day, it's like and let's face it, it's better than nothing. And what we know is that most people simply it's too much bother, so they just use time, which is not a good indicator. But I think, in a clinic environment where time is of the essence and force plates cost $30,000 and a 3D motion capture costs $100,000, and you need a team of experts like Lauren and Megan to be able to run the 3D mocap and then pull out the numbers, it's just too much. And so I think the easy thing to do is like, hey, what would work? And let's use these hops for distance. And it sort of makes sense, right? It's like, oh, that'll challenge, anybody can measure this anywhere. But unfortunately, unfortunately or fortunately, depending how you see it, the research eventually comes up behind the things we do. And, you always say, I don't have to be right, but somebody has to be right. In that sense, the word, the data speaks for itself, right? It's people can compensate in those tests quite easily, and it's not a great test for the knee joint. So I think at the end of the day, the ease of use is probably what drives a lot of our decision making. Habit. This is what I've always done. Well, this is what I was shown to do. And it's not just in the clinical environment. Like, it's the same thing in the world of education. Like, teachers are prone to just teaching how they want to teach, how they've always taught, how they were shown to teach, rather than what the best evidence says. So it's always tricky to make that mental switch towards the evidence.
Totally. And like we're always limited by our current state of knowledge. And we see it a lot where, you adopt a certain, framework or modality, and we're all bad for it. Like, it kind of becomes ingrained in your identity. And so when, new research does come out, we can't control our bias to be kind of like, we're being attacked for it. And so it is hard to kind of like change our ways because of that. But yeah, it's like, it's okay that we did that we used this was the norm before, because that was the best kind of solution we had at the time. And now with the exponential growth of technology, it's just like so many new doors are opened. It's just now about finding the ones that actually, they may be really great, but they actually make sense and they're actually useful to the people who are actually, boots on the ground needing to use it.
Totally. Love it. Okay, we got 2 minutes here. So one last question and we'll wrap it up here. You talked a lot about single leg jumps. What is the role of double leg jumps?
I think the role of double leg jumps is that, kind of coming back to the crux of the problem, right? Like, It's not all about symmetry. You know, if you have an incident where you injure both knees, you're probably pretty symmetrical, right? So that's not necessarily the bar we're chasing, is to have symmetry. What we want to see is that you've got good capacity, and your bilateral tests are an excellent indicator of your capacity. So your jump height, your reactive strength capacity, all of those things can be obtained from a bilateral jump. And because bilateral jumping is such a fundamental part of the things that we do in sport and in life, it serves as a kind of cornerstone measure of our muscle power and our rapid force capacity. And if you have the ability to measure things happening at the foot, like we would with Plantiga, where you could measure what's going on with the right and the left, you can then also obtain some measures of asymmetry, which I think is a really novel thing to be doing. And, you know, a lot of times, like if you're just using your phone, or you're using an opto jump, or you're using whatever other measure to look at jump height, it's really nice when you can see what's happening right and left in the context of injury, because now you know a capacity measure, plyometric ability, jump height, muscle power, but now I can also see the contribution left to right in those movements, which obviously we can report on, which I think is really cool.
And the bilateral jumps, it's a natural kind of complexity progression. Like, if you have someone who isn't probably, ready to be doing any type of single leg jump because they just don't have like the coordination, control to be able to do it safely and effectively, then starting with bilateral jumps is a good starting point progression to lead up to that.
Agreed.
All righty. Well, that's all the questions we have, and that is also all the time we have. So that worked out quite nicely. I think that's all we've got for you guys today. Thank you very much for joining us. And like Matt said, this was recorded and we will send it out if you'd like to watch it again afterwards. And happy Friday, everybody.
Happy Friday.
Take care.